The scent of lavender and vanilla wafted through the foyer the moment I stepped inside Clara's pristine Charleston home. I'd been to enough of these brunches to know the smells weren't accidental. Everything in Clara's world was curated, right down to the flowers chosen to distract you from the tension. The air conditioning hummed softly, blending with the string quartet playlist she played on low volume, as if we were in some period drama instead of the powder keg that was my husband's family. "Madeline, darling," Clara trilled, sweeping toward me in cream linen pants and a silk blouse that probably cost more than my entire week's work wardrobe. She air-kissed my cheeks, her cologne aggressively floral, her eyes scanning me like I was a vase out of place on her étagère. I pasted on the smile I'd perfected after years of family obligations and tolerated interactions. "Hi, Clara. Everything looks beautiful as always." Ethan trailed in behind me, already loosening the collar of his shirt like he'd just survived something monumental by arriving. "Coffee?" he asked, holding out a mug with an awkward smile. "Figured you'd want some before things get rolling." The mug was warm, but not scalding. Steam rose lazily from its surface, but something about the smell, it was wrong. Bitter, sure, but laced with a chemical tang that didn't belong in coffee. My stomach tensed. I knew that smell. I'd tasted it before, after brunches that ended with me doubled over in bed, chalking it up to food poisoning or stress. I'd always brushed it off, but lately the pattern had become impossible to ignore. This was the 5th time something had seemed off at Clara's gatherings. I looked up at Ethan, and something flickered behind his smile. Nervousness? Expectation? A beat too long passed before he said, "You okay?" I forced a smile, curling my fingers tighter around the handle. "Just tired," I murmured. "Didn't sleep much." "Then drink up," he said, almost too quickly. "You'll feel better." The mug hovered near my lips. I inhaled again, more deliberately this time, trying not to let the sudden thudding of my heart betray me. I couldn't drink this. Not with that smell. Not with the memories of last month's violent nausea still vivid in my mind. I turned slowly, pretending to stumble as I adjusted my purse strap. The mug tilted in my hand, and with a quiet gasp, I lost my grip, just enough to make the hot liquid splash onto the table and my dress. "Oh shoot," I said, setting the mug down fast and grabbing for a napkin. "Ugh, I'm such a klutz today." Clara's heels clicked across the marble floor as she swooped in with a perfectly folded dish towel. "Oh no. Here, let me help." Ethan made a strange sound behind me. Frustration? Disappointment? "I'll get you another cup," he offered, already turning toward the kitchen. I moved quicker. "No need. I'll grab one for both of us. Be right back." I walked toward the kitchen, heart pounding, glancing back only once to make sure no one followed. Alone by the counter, I found 2 identical mugs already prepared, still warm. I paused for a second, hesitating only briefly before switching them. Mine had a faint reddish tint around the rim. His was clean. I made sure to reverse them before returning. "Here," I said sweetly, handing him the cup that had originally been meant for me. "Thought I'd get yours too." Ethan blinked. "Thanks." He took it without suspicion. We sat. Clara launched into her usual schedule of updates, charity galas, investments, thinly veiled brags about her daughter's private school achievements. I nodded where appropriate, smiled on cue, and waited. I kept my mug near my lips but didn't drink. I watched Ethan closely. But he didn't take a sip either. Clara eventually reached for his cup, laughing at some joke her husband made, and took a gulp. The moment stretched too long. My fingers clenched around the ceramic of my own mug. Then Clara paused. She blinked rapidly, touched her temple, and swallowed hard. "God," she muttered. Suddenly lightheaded. Ethan's head snapped toward her. "What?" Clara stood, then staggered. Her hand caught the edge of the table, but it slid from beneath her. She collapsed to her knees with a choked gasp, her face contorting as if she were being crushed from the inside out. Panic erupted. Family members rushed to her side. I stood frozen, every breath tight in my lungs. Ethan was on the floor beside her, pale and wide-eyed, his hands shaking as he tried to hold her upright. "She drank from my cup," he whispered. And that's when it clicked. His voice wasn't shocked that Clara was sick. He was shocked it wasn't me. I slowly stepped back from the chaos, retreating toward the hallway where Clara's husband kept a study. I slipped inside and shut the door, my hands trembling now not from fear, but clarity. I took out my phone. I had the moment recorded. Ethan's voice, the swap, Clara drinking, the panic. Every second of it was mine to keep. I tapped the screen and began to record a new clip, narrating everything I'd seen. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. They had been trying to poison me. And now, the game had changed. I stood behind the heavy mahogany door of the study, the sounds of Clara's convulsions echoing from the dining room like a scene from a nightmare I wasn't meant to wake from. My hand tightened around my phone, the video I'd just captured still fresh on the screen. I hadn't stopped recording. I couldn't. Not after what I'd just seen, what I'd just realized. Clara was never meant to drink that coffee. That cup was meant for me. And Ethan. Ethan hadn't even tried to hide his reaction. She drank from my cup, he'd said, like a man who just watched his plan fall apart in slow motion. I pressed myself against the doorframe, breathing through my nose to fight the nausea threatening to rise. It wasn't from guilt or even fear. It was from the confirmation, the sick validation of every instinct I'd tried to smother for the last 6 months. I wasn't imagining it. The stomach pain, the dizziness, the sudden vomiting spells after brunches or dinners at Clara's house, they weren't flukes. They were calculated. Ethan's voice rose over the noise in the hallway outside. "Call an ambulance," he shouted. "Something's wrong with her." Something. Yes, something was very wrong, Ethan. I moved to the side window and watched as Clara's husband, flustered and red-faced, ushered guests out. Some looked horrified, others confused, most simply grateful they hadn't eaten yet. I stayed in the shadows, heart thudding with purpose now, not fear. I needed to think like Ethan and Clara had: cold, controlled, efficient. No more emotional reactions. No more doubt. That was their weapon, wasn't it? Making me doubt my reality. But now I had the truth in a clip no longer than 30 seconds. I stepped out of the study just as paramedics burst through the front door. Ethan was kneeling beside Clara, who was now lying on her side, barely conscious, her skin a mottled shade of gray. His face twisted in worry, but I could see the cracks in the performance. His hands were clenched too tight. His eyes darted toward the kitchen, then toward me. When he saw me standing there, he flinched. "Madeline, what happened?" he stammered. I met his gaze evenly. "I don't know. I thought you gave me that coffee." His mouth opened, then closed. One of the paramedics shoved him back as they secured Clara onto the gurney. She was barely responsive, her limbs twitching involuntarily. It was too close to what had happened to me after last month's brunch. Too precise. Too deliberate. I took a breath and pulled out my phone. "I need to speak to someone," I told one of the EMTs, who nodded and gestured to the police officer who had followed them in. While Ethan paced the entryway and Clara was lifted into the ambulance, I stood with Officer Jenks and played the clip from my phone. His face went stone cold halfway through, especially when Ethan's voice muttered, "She drank from my cup." "That's your husband?" Jenks asked. "Yes," I said. And that was the cup he handed to me. He didn't need much more. He called it in immediately, requesting backup and dispatching someone to secure the scene. For the first time in months, maybe longer, I felt grounded. Focused. I wasn't the anxious wife anymore, questioning her own memory. I was a witness. No, more than that. I was the target. The officer took my statement, asking questions about Clara's condition, about the pattern of illness, about when it started. I gave him dates. Details. Times when I had been the only one sick. Recipes Clara had insisted on making just for me. Wines poured before I could choose my own glass. I even pulled up the voice memos I had started taking last month after my stomach lining had become inflamed and I'd spent 2 days in urgent care. I'd told myself it was paranoia. But I kept recording. "Do you have reason to believe this was intentional?" he asked. I looked over at Ethan, who was standing outside the house now, watching the ambulance doors close with a blank stare. "Yes," I said. "I do." And I think the coffee today proves it. Jenks nodded. You'll need to come to the hospital. They'll want your statement on record, and the detective assigned to the case will want to see this video. Of course. Ethan moved to intercept me as I stepped outside. Madeline, this is crazy. Clara must have had some kind of allergic reaction or… Save it, I said flatly. You're not that good of an actor. He froze. What are you talking about? I didn't bother answering. I slid into the back of the police cruiser, the phone still warm in my palm. I watched as Ethan stood alone on the lawn, eyes hollow, unsure whether to follow or run. The ambulance had already disappeared down the street. Clara, for once, wasn't orchestrating anything. And Ethan? He'd just watched the entire performance collapse in real time. As the cruiser pulled away, I whispered under my breath, "You wanted me gone. You made me sick. And now you're going to find out exactly how sharp I am when I'm not under your spell." I didn't know what would come next, but I knew this. The game was over. And I had just flipped the board. The fluorescent lights of St. Augustine Medical Center flickered as I walked through the ER entrance, the chill of sterile air brushing against my skin. I could still feel Ethan's gaze from earlier, burning into the back of my neck like a warning or a plea. I wasn't sure which anymore. It didn't matter. I had facts now. Evidence. And I was done pretending to be the unsuspecting wife. The officer at the front desk waved me through after a brief check-in, and a nurse escorted me down a narrow corridor, her shoes squeaking with every step. "Dr. Whitaker and Detective Ramirez will meet you in consultation room B," she said, holding the door open. Inside, the walls were painted an unconvincing shade of pale green, and the room held nothing but a rectangular table, a few chairs, and a water cooler humming quietly in the corner. I sat down, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my phone resting face up on the table. I could still see the last frame of the video, Ethan's shocked expression frozen in time. The silence ticked on for a few minutes before the door opened. Dr. Whitaker, tall and composed in a crisp white coat, entered first. I remembered him from my own visits here months ago when I'd come in with nausea and dehydration that no one could explain. He looked at me back then like I was fragile glass. Today, he looked at me like someone who'd finally proven their case. Behind him walked Detective Ramirez, her posture sharp, her hair pulled back into a low braid that meant business. She gave me a nod, then sat across from me, pulling out a notepad. "Mrs. Maddox," she began, "I want to start by confirming a few details before we get into what you recorded. First, you've stated that you've been experiencing recurring illnesses over the past 6 months, correct?" "Yes," I said clearly. "Only at family events hosted by my sister-in-law, Clara. Every single time I ate or drank something there, I'd fall sick within a few hours." Dr. Whitaker nodded. "You were seen here twice. Both times for gastrointestinal distress. We couldn't pinpoint the cause, but it was consistent with mild toxin exposure." I turned toward him. "I thought I was losing my mind. You know that?" I started wondering if it was stress or if I had food intolerances I didn't know about. But it always went away until the next brunch or dinner. Ramirez scribbled something in her notebook. "And today, at this brunch, your sister-in-law Clara consumed the drink meant for you?" "Yes," I said, sliding my phone across the table. "It's all here. I recorded everything." Dr. Whitaker picked up the device, tapped play, and we listened together. Clara's voice, Ethan's mine. The clink of the mug. The moment Clara drank. And then Ethan's reaction. She drank from my cup. The room was silent except for the recording, which ended with Clara collapsing and the chaos that followed. Ramirez's pen stopped moving. "That doesn't sound like surprise," she murmured. "That sounds like regret." I swallowed hard. Because he wasn't expecting her to drink it. He handed me that cup himself. It smelled off. Bitter and metallic. So I switched it with his. I thought I was protecting myself. "You were," Dr. Whitaker said, his voice gentler now. Clara's talk screen came back less than 20 minutes ago. She ingested a low dose of a rare compound, ethyl paroxone. It's a derivative of organophosphates. Highly toxic. Not something you find lying around the house. The words landed like bricks in my chest. So, this wasn't a kitchen accident. No, he said firmly. This was deliberate poisoning. If she had consumed a higher dose, she could have died. Ramirez leaned forward. Do you have any other documentation? Anything you can give us that shows a pattern? Motive? Opportunity. I've been keeping logs for months, I replied, reaching into my bag and pulling out a slim folder. I didn't know what I was looking for at first, but I kept records anyway, dates, what I ate, how I felt, how long the symptoms lasted. I even kept the packaging from some of the meals she gave me. And last week, I found something in Ethan's office, prescription bottles with strange labels, no pharmacy markings. I took pictures. Ramirez's eyes lit with interest as she took the folder. We'll need those bottles for testing, but your records are a strong start. Any idea where they might have gotten something like ethyl paroxone? Ethan works in biotech, I said bitterly. So does Clara. She handles contracts for a research lab near Beaufort. If anyone could get access to something like that, it's them. Whitaker looked at Ramirez. That matches with the compound. It's not easy to come by, and it's certainly not in any household cleaner. Ramirez nodded. Then we're not looking at negligence. We're looking at intent. I leaned back, exhaling for what felt like the first time all day. The cold edges of the room blurred just slightly. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't weak or overly sensitive. I had been a target, and I had survived. Where's Ethan now? I asked. Still at the house, Ramirez answered. We didn't arrest him immediately, but that may change once we cross-check the lab connections. We'll be bringing him in for questioning. I nodded slowly. He thought he could make me sick and keep me off my game, maybe even ruin my career. But he didn't expect me to pay attention. Ramirez smiled faintly. He underestimated the wrong woman. As the meeting wrapped up and the detective collected my evidence, I stood and looked out the tiny window overlooking the parking lot. The sky was a stark, brilliant blue, mocking almost in its perfection. But in that moment, I knew something had shifted. The pieces were moving now. And I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was fighting back. The quiet hum of the hospital waiting room pressed in around me as I sat near the end of the corridor, arms crossed, my foot tapping restlessly against the floor. Through the thin glass of the observation room ahead, I could see Clara seated at the metal table, pale and exhausted in her hospital gown, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the paper cup of water she hadn't sipped from in 10 minutes. The steady beep of monitors behind the glass punctuated her silence. Detective Ramirez stood just to the side, her arms folded as she spoke softly but firmly. Clara had refused to speak to anyone else. Not her husband. Not even Ethan. But when Ramirez mentioned my name, said I had provided evidence, detailed logs, and the very mug that had nearly ended her life, something shifted. Clara had asked to speak. Alone, first. And now, after nearly an hour of back and forth, her carefully composed mask had begun to crack. Ramirez opened the door and waved me in. I stood, brushing imaginary wrinkles from my blouse as I approached, swallowing the rush of adrenaline that made my knees want to give out. Clara looked up the moment I stepped in. Her eyes, usually sharp and haughty, were rimmed red and glistening. I didn't say anything at first. I simply sat across from her, folding my hands calmly on the table. The silence between us stretched for a moment, heavy and thick, until Clara exhaled shakily. You were never supposed to drink it, she whispered. There it was. Not an apology. A confession. You think that makes it better? I asked, my voice low but steady. That I was only supposed to be, what? Incapacitated? She winced, her fingers tightening around the cup. It was just supposed to make you sick. Nothing serious. Ethan didn't want to hurt you, just stop you for a while. My jaw clenched. Stop me from what? Clara hesitated. Then, as if a dam broke behind her eyes, the words came tumbling out. The Langford account, she said bitterly. You weren't supposed to be in that meeting. You were taking everything. The attention, the success. Ethan was furious. Said you'd pushed him aside. That he'd built his career and suddenly you were the one they all wanted. He felt threatened. I finished for her. He felt threatened by my work, my growth. So instead of competing fairly, he decided to poison me. Clara shook her head wildly. It wasn't like that. He wanted you to slow down. He said you needed rest. That you were overdoing it. I laughed, but the sound came out hollow. So you both decided to take away my control over my own body. You sat there at brunch after brunch, smiling while I got sicker and sicker. Did it ever cross your mind that it might go too far? Clara looked away, her shoulders curling inward. It got out of hand. We didn't expect the effects to linger. We thought you'd skip a day or two of work, maybe get spooked enough to scale back. You wanted me to doubt myself, I said coldly. You wanted me to think I was fragile. Ramirez stepped in again then, nodding toward Clara. We've recorded this conversation with your consent. I'd advise you to say anything else now while you have the chance to speak freely. Clara wiped her eyes and let out a harsh, humorless laugh. It was supposed to be just me helping Ethan. He said he didn't want to lose everything to you. And I wanted him to feel like he still had control. So you became his accomplice, I said, watching her with something close to disgust. You drugged my food, my drinks. You covered for him. Lied to my face. I thought if I didn't help, he'd spiral, she said, voice cracking. He's not who you think he is, Maddie. He's careful. Calculating. You don't know the things he said. I know enough, I said. Ramirez stepped closer. Can you provide any proof? Communications between you two? Any record of Ethan discussing the poisoning or the Langford sabotage? Clara nodded slowly. My phone. There are texts. He didn't always use direct words, but he'd refer to the doses. He tracked your symptoms. I kept everything. I didn't delete anything. Ramirez gave her a sharp nod. We'll need that immediately. If what you're saying is true, we're looking at conspiracy and attempted murder. Clara shrank back into the chair, her expression empty now. The defiance, the poise, all of it gone. I stood, ready to leave. Maddie, Clara called out weakly. I didn't hate you. I paused at the door, not bothering to turn back. That's funny, I said. Because you acted like you did. And then I walked out of that room, the door closing firmly behind me. For the first time since this all began, the truth wasn't just living in my head anymore. It was out in the open, ugly, and undeniable. They had underestimated me. But now, the game was mine to finish. I sat at our kitchen table, the wood cool beneath my fingertips, the morning light cutting sharp lines across Ethan's once perfectly organized home office that now looked like a crime scene paused in time. I had asked for access to retrieve a few things, just long enough to gather the final pieces. The detective had agreed, with the condition that an officer accompanied me. He stood in the hallway now, pretending not to listen but clearly alert. The manila envelope in front of me was stuffed with what I hadn't realized I'd been collecting for months, small pieces, seemingly insignificant, now lined up like dominoes that pointed to one horrific truth. Ethan hadn't just wanted to sabotage me. He'd planned it meticulously. I slid open the drawer to his desk again and pulled out the prescription bottles I'd found a week ago but had convinced myself were just for research. No pharmacy label. Just cryptic codes, dates, and dosage amounts. Now, they were damning. Each bottle contained chemicals that shouldn't have been outside a lab, much less in our home. Some I couldn't pronounce, others I recognized from the research I'd done after my last hospital visit. The same chemicals used in microdoses to incapacitate lab mice. Ethan had labeled them like supplements, vitamin C, omega-3, but they were anything but. Beside the bottles were printed text logs from his phone I'd backed up to my laptop. Some were short, vague. 0.3 milligrams worked. She'll miss Monday. Don't overdo it before the pitch. Others were sickeningly direct. One read, Langford's deadline is Tuesday. Keep her in bed until then. Langford. It always circled back to that account. The one I had landed after months of 3 a.m. drafts, client dinners, strategy sessions. The one that gave me a seat at the table Ethan had always assumed was his. He couldn't take that I'd outpaced him. And instead of leveling up, he decided to take me down in doses. I documented everything. Lined up the bottles, snapped high-resolution photos, noted the batch numbers, and cross-referenced them with a public database of chemical supplies used in biotech labs. One name popped up again and again, Clara's former classmate, now a technician at a private research facility 2 hours away. She must have been the connection. Clara supplied the access, and Ethan managed the delivery. I could still hear Clara's voice from the hospital room, brittle with regret. He tracked your symptoms. He said he didn't want to lose everything to you. And I believed her, not because I pitied her, but because it fit. The coldness, the calculated scale of what they'd done. It was never emotional. It was strategic. And that made it all the more vile. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I compiled the final document, an indexed report for Detective Ramirez. I included the date of every incident, each symptom I experienced, the food or drink involved, and the matching texts or calls from Ethan that correlated. I even had a screenshot of a Google search he'd made, non-lethal toxins to induce vomiting. The trail wasn't just obvious now, it was mapped out like a blueprint of betrayal. I paused when I reached the part about the voice memos. Those were the hardest to relive. Some of them I'd recorded in bed, my voice slurred with exhaustion. Others were angry rants I never planned to share. But they documented the emotional spiral I had lived through, the fear, the gaslighting, the isolation. Ethan had made me question my own body, my own instincts. And now I had every reason to trust them again. I clicked Save and transferred the full file to a secure USB drive, slipping it into a padded case. Just then, my eyes fell on one last item tucked in the drawer, a small, silver bracelet I hadn't worn in months. Ethan had given it to me after my first trip to the ER. I remembered now, he'd said it was to cheer me up. A simple, hollow gesture to mask what he knew he'd caused. I held it in my palm, feeling its weight, then set it back down. I didn't need souvenirs of survival. I needed justice. As I stepped into the hallway, the officer gave me a questioning look. Got what you needed? I nodded. More than enough. We drove back to the precinct in silence. I watched the city blur past the window, familiar streets now carrying the weight of secrets I couldn't ignore. When we arrived, Detective Ramirez was already waiting, her expression sharp as ever. I handed over the envelope and USB drive without a word. She opened it, scanned a few pages, then looked up at me. This is thorough, she said. And damning. The lab connection, the text history, the chemicals. This will be more than enough for a warrant and formal charges. I felt a strange stillness settle in my chest, relief, maybe. Or the calm before whatever storm came next. He thought I wouldn't notice, I said quietly. He thought I'd be too distracted, too tired to piece it all together. Ramirez smiled grimly. He picked the wrong woman. I nodded. For the first time in months, I felt whole again, not because the betrayal hurt less, but because I had taken back control. One piece at a time. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not just from the humming AC or the sterile walls, but from the heavy silence that fell as people took their seats. It was the kind of quiet that made every cough, every shuffle of paper, echo like thunder. I sat at the front, just behind the prosecutor's table, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I had chosen a simple navy dress, nothing flashy. I didn't want to look like someone trying to impress. I wanted to look like someone telling the truth. Ethan sat across the room, flanked by his defense team. Clara was 2 seats away, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She hadn't looked at me once since entering the room. Good. I didn't need apologies anymore. I needed justice. The judge entered, and the room rose. My breath caught for just a second before I exhaled slowly, centering myself. I wasn't here to watch passively. I was a key witness. The woman they tried to silence. The prosecution opened with a measured tone, laying out the facts, how I'd fallen ill repeatedly, how the symptoms matched known toxins, how Clara had been hospitalized after ingesting the same coffee meant for me. But it was the moment Dr. Whitaker took the stand that everything shifted. He spoke with calm authority, reviewing the toxicology reports in detail. Ethyl pyroxone, he explained to the jury, is a dangerous organophosphate compound not available over the counter. It affects the nervous system. In small doses, it causes dizziness, nausea, muscle tremors, exactly what Mrs. Maddox experienced repeatedly. In large doses, like what Clara ingested, it can be fatal. The defense tried to argue uncertainty. That maybe Clara had consumed something else before the brunch. That maybe Madeline and me had mistakenly misremembered events. But Whitaker shut it down smoothly. I reviewed her medical history. The pattern is clear. Symptoms occurred following every family event hosted by Clara Maddox. And when the coffee intended for her was consumed by Clara, the results were near instantaneous and aligned precisely with prior complaints. This was no coincidence. Next came the experts, a chemical safety officer, a lab technician from Clara's previous employer, and then a digital forensics specialist who pulled up the text messages and emails Ethan and Clara never thought anyone would see. I sat still, my pulse a steady drumbeat in my ears as their words painted the picture I already knew by heart. Keep her down for 2 days. She can't make the pitch. That one was the worst. It played in the courtroom like a line from a movie. I recognized Ethan's voice on the audio clip, flat, unbothered, casual. I looked at him then. He didn't flinch. Didn't show remorse. Just kept his eyes forward, jaw tight. Clara's voice followed. That'll be enough. She'll be too sick to focus. It didn't matter how softly they'd said it. It was damning. Then came my turn. I rose and walked to the witness stand, the air thick with eyes watching me. The oath felt oddly comforting. Like a line I could stand on, something solid. I told them everything. About the brunches. The symptoms. The fake stumble that saved my life. The mug. The look on Ethan's face when Clara drank the coffee. The way he'd said, she drank from my cup, like someone watching his plan unravel. The prosecutor played the clip again while I sat there, listening to my own voice narrating the moment in real time. I had recorded it for my sanity, to prove I wasn't losing my grip. I never imagined it would be played to a jury. Why did you record it, Mrs. Maddox? The prosecutor asked. Because I stopped trusting my instincts, I said. They had me doubting myself for months. I needed proof. And I got it. The defense tried to paint me as paranoid. Overworked. Maybe even vengeful. Isn't it true, the defense attorney asked, that your husband supported your career? That he attended events with you, celebrated your promotions? Yes, I said simply. Until I outpaced him. He frowned. So you're saying this is all about jealousy? I'm saying it's about control, I said calmly. Ethan didn't care that I was successful. He cared that I didn't need him to be. There was a pause in the room that stretched long and thick. Even the jury seemed to lean forward. When I stepped down, I didn't look back at Ethan. I returned to my seat and stared straight ahead, listening as closing arguments began. The prosecutor painted a picture so vivid and terrifying that it turned my stomach, and yet it was all true. They had planned it. Slowly, carefully. They had poisoned me in increments. Calculated every sick day. Every missed meeting. When the final arguments wrapped, the jury was dismissed. The courtroom emptied in hushed murmurs. I stayed behind, my palms pressed together tightly in my lap, adrenaline still humming beneath my skin. Ramirez joined me at the front. You did exactly what you needed to do. I still don't feel like I've won, I whispered. You will, she said. This part is almost over. And then, it's their turn to feel powerless. I watched Ethan being led out of the courtroom, a bailiff flanking him. He didn't glance my way. Clara followed soon after, her eyes hollow, her hands cuffed. I stared at them both and didn't feel hate. I felt clarity. They had tried to dim my light. Instead, they exposed their own darkness to the world. And tomorrow, the verdict would speak louder than any revenge ever could. The courtroom was silent, thick with tension as the bailiff stepped forward to deliver the envelope. I sat motionless, my hands clenched in my lap, the pressure of the polished wood bench pressing against my back. All I could hear was the slow, steady rhythm of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. It had all led to this. Months of confusion, illness, suspicion. Weeks of investigation, evidence, testimony. And now, it came down to a few words from a panel of strangers who had listened and watched with guarded eyes. Ethan sat to my left, separated by rows of attorneys and formality, but I could feel the weight of his presence as if he were right beside me. He looked thinner, more tired than I'd ever seen him, the smugness that once simmered just under the surface long gone. Clara, further down, stared blankly ahead, her carefully curated composure unraveling piece by piece since the trial began. "All rise," the bailiff said, and we stood in unison. The judge returned, nodding toward the jury foreperson. The man stood, holding a crisp white sheet of paper. He didn't clear his throat, didn't hesitate. His voice was steady. "In the case of the state versus Ethan Maddox and Clara Maddox, on the charge of attempted murder in the second degree, we find the defendants guilty." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. "On the charge of criminal conspiracy, we find the defendants guilty." The words echoed like thunder, final and irreversible. I closed my eyes, just for a moment, and let the verdict settle in my bones. Not because I was surprised, I wasn't, but because it meant the world finally saw what I had endured, what they had done, what I had survived. There were gasps behind me, murmurs, the distant sound of someone crying. Maybe a relative. Maybe Clara's mother, who had sat 2 rows back every day, her face twisted with disbelief. But I stayed focused. I watched as the judge turned to the defendants. "Given the premeditated nature of this crime," he said, voice steady but grave, "and the overwhelming evidence presented in this court finds no justification for leniency. The use of chemical compounds to systematically poison another human being, particularly a spouse, is among the most insidious acts of betrayal imaginable. The fact that this was done under the guise of family, during routine gatherings intended to foster trust and connection, only deepens the violation." He turned to Ethan, who stood now, pale and stiff. "Ethan Maddox, you are hereby sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempted murder and conspiracy, with no possibility of parole for the first 12. Then to Clara. "Clara Maddox, you are sentenced to 15 years in prison for your role in the conspiracy and your active participation in the distribution and administration of toxic substances." I didn't cry. I thought I might. But instead, I felt a strange stillness, like my body knew there would be time for emotion later. For now, I had to absorb every second of this moment. The clink of the handcuffs. The way Ethan's jaw tightened when they led him forward. The way Clara finally turned her head to look at me and found no sympathy in my eyes. I stood only when the judge dismissed us. As I gathered my things, Ramirez approached, her expression unreadable. "You held your ground," she said quietly. "I almost didn't," I admitted. There were so many nights I told myself I was imagining it all, that I was making a big deal out of nothing. I started to believe them. "That's what people like that count on," she said. "They build the lie so slowly you don't notice until you're drowning in it." I nodded, gripping the strap of my bag. "I'm just relieved it's over." Ramirez offered a small, knowing smile. "It's the end of one chapter, but not the end of your story." As I stepped out of the courthouse, the afternoon sun poured over the marble steps like a spotlight. Reporters clustered near the bottom, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions I had no intention of answering. I paused, took a breath, and walked past them with my head held high. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. The verdict had spoken louder than I ever could. Back at home, I stood in the middle of the kitchen, that cursed kitchen where I'd once sipped for mugs with a metallic aftertaste, where I'd questioned my own strength and memory. It looked the same, but everything had changed. I placed the court documents in a drawer, locked it, and slid the key into my desk. I didn't need to revisit the details again. They were a part of my past now, not my future. Later that evening, I poured myself a glass of wine, not out of celebration, but quiet reflection. I stood by the window, watching the wind rustle the branches in our backyard, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Ethan and Clara had tried to poison more than my body. They'd tried to poison my spirit, my confidence, my grip on reality. But I had endured. I had exposed them. And now, as they faced the consequences of their crimes, I was finally free to live on my terms. The verdict had done more than punish them, it had restored me. And no matter what came next, I would never let anyone make me doubt myself again. The ballroom was alive with chatter, champagne flutes clinking, heels tapping softly on marble tile. A warm cascade of light glowed from the chandeliers above, glittering off glass and polished wood. I stood behind the curtain at the back of the stage, waiting for my name to be announced. My heart wasn't racing from nerves this time. It beat with a quiet, resolute rhythm. Steady. Sure. Strong. It had been a year since that verdict. A year since Ethan and Clara were led out of that courtroom in handcuffs. A year since I chose not to disappear but to rise, even when my world had been turned inside out. And now, the host's voice echoed through the room. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Madeline Maddox, founder of Phoenix Strategies and recipient of this year's Rising Leader Award. The applause broke out before I even stepped forward, but it wasn't the clapping that moved me. It was the fact that I was here. Whole. Standing on my own terms. I walked onto the stage slowly, purposefully, the spotlight warm on my shoulders as I took the podium and scanned the crowd. Colleagues, peers, students. Some had followed my career since the beginning. Others only knew me from headlines. But they were all watching, waiting to hear what I had to say. I took a breath, leaned into the mic, and spoke clearly. I want to tell you a story, I began, letting the room settle. Not the story you might have read in the news or the courtroom transcripts. I want to tell you the real story, the one about what it means to fall apart and choose, every single day, to put yourself back together. You could have heard a pin drop. About a year ago, I stood in a courtroom and listened to a judge hand down a sentence to two people who had tried to sabotage me from the inside out. They poisoned my food, my drinks, and for months I thought I was just failing. I doubted my own body, my memory, my ability to perform. And in this world, especially as a woman in leadership, self-doubt is an invitation for others to take over your narrative. I paused, letting that truth land. There were nods in the audience, quiet murmurs of understanding. But when I hit rock bottom, something in me refused to stay there. I started writing things down, recording what I felt, what I ate, who handed me what. At first, I didn't do it because I believed I'd been wronged. I did it because I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. My voice didn't shake. Not even a little. That evidence saved my life. That instinct, the one we so often ignore, was the difference between silence and survival. I share this not because I want pity or applause. I share this because every one of you has that same instinct. Whether you're negotiating a contract, pitching to a boardroom, or walking into a room full of doubters, you know. Deep down, you always know. The real question is, will you listen? I paused, feeling the emotion rise in my chest, but I kept it controlled, channeled into something sharper. They wanted to slow me down. That was the plan. Not to destroy me, but to make me doubt myself enough to disappear. And the truth is, I almost did. But now, I've never stood taller. I lifted my eyes, scanning the room, taking in the silent power in the expressions around me, some tearful, some fierce, some reflective. When the company I built with Ethan crumbled, I didn't just rebuild it, I reimagined it. Phoenix Strategies wasn't just a name. It was a promise. A reminder that from the ashes of betrayal and pain, something stronger can rise. Applause broke out again, this time spontaneous, sweeping across the room like a tide. I let it wash over me before raising a hand, gently asking for silence again. So here's my message to all of you tonight. Don't fear your downfall. Fear giving away your power to those who haven't earned it. Trust your intuition. Document what matters. Ask the hard questions, even when the answers might shatter your world. Because when you survive the worst of it, what's left is something unbreakable. I stepped back from the mic, the applause swelling once more, louder, deeper. This time I smiled, not out of relief, but triumph. Later, after the speeches and the photographs, I stood by a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the harbor. The city lights reflected on the water like stars that had slipped too low. I sipped my sparkling water slowly, watching boats drift in the distance. Alone, yes, but not lonely. A young woman approached me, maybe 25, eyes bright and nervous. "Ms. Maddox," she said, "your speech, it was everything. I just started my own consulting firm, and sometimes I feel like I have to apologize for being ambitious." I turned to face her fully. "Never apologize for ambition," I said. The people who try to make you feel small are usually scared of how big you might get. She beamed. Thank you. Truly. I nodded, watching her disappear back into the crowd. And I realized then that this moment was the real win. Not the courtroom, not the sentencing, but standing here, whole and unshaken, knowing I had built something new from the wreckage. Rising hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. The renewal notice for the Langford account sat at the top of my inbox, bolded and crisp, like a silent victory waiting for my acknowledgement. I stared at it for a few seconds before clicking it open. There it was, confirmation that Langford and Associates had chosen to extend our contract for another 3 years. No hesitation, no renegotiation. Just a simple line, we look forward to continuing our work with Phoenix Strategies and Madeline Maddox. I leaned back in my chair, the edges of the document blurring slightly as a smile spread across my face. This was more than a renewal. It was a reclamation. A full-circle moment that not only validated the work I'd poured into the account, but silenced the echoes of the plan Ethan and Clara once tried to execute. I remembered the moment I'd first presented to Langford. Sharp suit, detailed strategy, standing beside Ethan, though his eyes had been anything but supportive. He'd nodded along, sure. He'd smiled for the client. But behind closed doors, he'd accused me of overshadowing him, of being too aggressive, too visible. You're not the face of this firm, Maddie, he'd once snapped. Don't forget that. He was wrong then. And this email, this contract, this clean, decisive extension, it proved it. I printed the document, not because I needed a physical copy, but because some things deserved to be held in your hands. Proof. Vindication. Justice in its most poetic form. I clipped it to the corkboard behind my desk, right next to the first check I ever received under my new company name. Phoenix Strategies. Born from ruin, built on resilience. Outside my office window, the Charleston skyline shimmered under the late morning sun. I sipped from my coffee, strong, hot, and completely safe. The bitter edge made me smile, not flinch. It still amazed me how something as simple as a cup of coffee had nearly been my undoing. How it had become the catalyst for everything that followed. My phone buzzed on the desk beside me. A news alert. I glanced down, expecting something dull, markets, weather, another update I didn't need. But then I saw their names. Former power couple Ethan and Clara Maddox receive final sentencing assignments. I stared at the headline unread, my thumb hovering over the screen. But I didn't open it. I didn't need to read the details. I already knew how the story ended. I'd lived it. Testified through it. I could imagine the article easily, pictures of them in court, excerpts from the judge's statement, maybe a quote or two from the prosecution about the rare nature of the case and how unusual it was for attempted poisoning to be so thoroughly documented. Maybe the press would label it high society scandal or domestic betrayal. But for me, it was just Tuesday. Another day running a company built from the ashes of what they tried to destroy. I silenced the alert, let it disappear, and returned my focus to the emails waiting for my response. A new client from Savannah. A logistics firm in need of a rebrand. A mentorship program requesting a guest speaker. I skimmed through them, eyes scanning quickly, already forming plans. The past no longer held my attention. The future had my full devotion. Later that afternoon, I walked through the open workspace of my office, sunlight pouring through wide windows, the hum of focused conversation rising around me. My team looked up as I passed, smiling, nodding. They didn't see a woman shaped by scandal. They saw their leader. Someone who had built something solid, rooted in transparency and excellence. Hey, Madeline, my assistant Lauren called from her desk. Langford sent over a thank you package. It's in your office. I raised a brow. That was fast. She grinned. They're clearly excited. It's from their marketing team. Looks like champagne and some branded merch. Also, the Savannah proposal draft is ready whenever you are. Perfect. I'll review it before 5. Inside my office, a sleek black gift bag waited beside the door. Sure enough, nestled inside was a bottle of champagne and a card that read, "Thank you for guiding us through one of our most successful years to date." Here's to more ahead, Langford and Associates. I set the bottle on the shelf beside my awards, right between the Rising Leader plaque and the framed print of my very first Phoenix logo sketch. A simple line drawing of a bird in mid-flight, unfinished wings stretching upward. I'd drawn it on a napkin in a hospital waiting room, of all places. Strange how some of our strongest beginnings are born in the bleakest places. As I closed the door behind me, I caught my reflection in the glass, older now, perhaps a little harder around the edges, but undeniably stronger. My posture straighter. My eyes sharper. I didn't need closure. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to track Ethan and Clara's every consequence. Their story had unraveled exactly as it should. And mine? Mine was still unfolding, chapter by chapter, entirely in my hands. Justice wasn't about watching them fall. It was about choosing to rise and never looking back. The morning was still, the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than eerie. I stepped onto the back porch with a fresh cup of coffee, my own blend now, hand-picked beans, no mystery ingredients, no lingering anxiety. The air was crisp with the first hints of spring, and the garden below had finally begun to bloom again. It felt symbolic. Everything did lately. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the way that happens when life has stripped you down to your bones and you've chosen to rebuild, not with haste, but with intention. A year ago, my life had been defined by suspicion, betrayal, and a gnawing fear that something was wrong, but that maybe it was me. Now, that fear was gone. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. And the house I once tiptoed through, always wondering what lay beneath the surface, was now mine in every way. Stripped, renovated, reclaimed. Inside, my phone buzzed with the day's schedule, but I let it ring out. I'd return to work soon enough. For now, I wanted to sit in the stillness and savor what it meant to have a life again, one not weighed down by manipulation or deceit. The porch swing creaked as I settled into it, wrapping one arm around the cushion beside me. There had been a time I would have saved that space for Ethan. Not anymore. I had learned that the most powerful act of resistance wasn't confrontation. It was disconnection. Not from myself, but from the people who tried to write my story for me. When I'd founded Phoenix Strategies, it hadn't been just a professional pivot. It had been a declaration. I didn't want to keep chasing stability from the ruins. I wanted to build something completely my own. And now, with each passing month, that vision was growing. New clients, a rising reputation, and, more importantly, a team of people who worked with integrity, who respected boundaries, transparency, and accountability. Qualities I once hoped for in my marriage and my family, only to find them buried beneath ego and resentment. There were still questions sometimes. People who asked if I had forgiven Ethan or Clara. As if forgiveness was the final step on some healing staircase. I used to think maybe that was true. But now? I wasn't waiting for forgiveness. I didn't need to reach that plateau to move forward. I didn't need to label my peace as absolution. Some people make choices that remove themselves from your life permanently. That's not bitterness. That's clarity. I heard the soft chime of an email notification from inside. The sound didn't jolt me the way it once would have. I used to flinch, worry it was another message from Ethan trying to manipulate the narrative, or some tabloid request disguised as sympathy. But those requests had faded. The world had moved on. More importantly, I stood, stretching slightly, and stepped back inside. The house smelled like citrus and cedar, my choice. Not Clara's scented candles, not Ethan's cologne lingering in the hallways. I had spent months scrubbing the house clean, repainting the walls, donating every dish, every linen, every item tainted with old energy. It wasn't a purge out of rage. It was a quiet rebellion. My way of making space for something real. At the counter, I opened the laptop and checked the new message. It was from a young consultant in Denver, someone who had followed my story after the summit and now wanted to bring Phoenix Strategies in to help guide their leadership team through a transition. I smiled. These were the kinds of opportunities one once dreamed of. They were happening now because I had dared to keep moving, even when every part of me wanted to freeze in place. I typed back a thoughtful reply, my fingers moving confidently across the keys. There was no hesitancy in me anymore. No need to second-guess whether I was strong enough, smart enough, or enough of anything. I had survived the worst kind of betrayal, the kind that comes from people who are supposed to love you, and I had come out whole. Not untouched, but definitely unbroken. By noon, I had finalized a new contract, completed a strategy deck, and called one of my interns to congratulate her on her first client pitch. The team was thriving. So was I. And not because I'd won against Ethan and Clara. Thriving, I'd come to understand, wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving myself right. Right to trust my instincts. Right to protect my peace. Right to leave behind everything that no longer served the life I wanted. I stepped outside again, the sun higher now, casting soft shadows across the patio. I reached down to pull a few weeds from the edge of the garden, tiny invaders trying to reclaim space. But they came up easily. They had no real roots anymore. Not here. Not in this new chapter. And as I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands, I knew something deep in my bones. I didn't need to look back anymore. The past would always be there, tucked away in court transcripts and old memories, but it no longer defined me. I was Madeline Maddox. Not the woman they tried to poison, silence, or sabotage. But the woman who lived. The woman who thrived. And the woman who would write the rest of her story exactly the way she chose.